So through the same source that I talked about in the previous video, kind of discovering a bunch of Gen 6 models when he queried the raw data from the Glock website, he also discovered V models, and from what I understand and just kind of looking at what's being talked about on social media and talking to some people that have contacts at Glock, essentially the V models are supposed to be more difficult or have some kind of feature in them to make them more difficult or not work with current models of Glock switches. And I think that's pretty interesting because the Generation 5 guns already have a feature like that built into them. Now, if I show you exactly what little piece of plastic they put into them so that you can't just readily put a standard Glock switch into them, well, I don't think YouTube would be super happy with that. And it's funny because some aftermarket triggers won't actually work with that installed, so you actually have to remove them before you put the trigger into the Gen 5 Glocks. But I think it's interesting that they would call these V models, considering that V is the Roman numeral for 5 and Generation 5s already have this feature. So I think the reason why they're doing this is because Glock has actually been sued by several states because these states claim that Glock pistols are somehow more readily convertible to fully automatic firing or something like that, which I don't think that's necessarily true. I think it's just the fact that Glocks are extremely popular. Glocks are the most popular handgun of the 21st century. And so if you're going to make any sort of aftermarket part or feature for it, you're probably going to make them for a Glock first before anything else, or at least consider making them for a Glock. If you were going to start a holster company, for example, like what pistol models do you think you would consider first out of all of the available pistol models out there? Probably a Glock 17 and a Glock 19, right? Now, the biggest news to come out of all of this recently is that California has indirectly, or kind of directly banned Glocks. I mean, everyone colloquially called it a Glock ban. If you look at the actual verbiage of the law, they state cruciform trigger bar. So what is a cruciform trigger bar? A cruciform trigger bar is the way a Glock trigger bar is shaped. It has a little cross shape. This plus shape is called the cruciform, right? Because it's cross shaped. And this leg right here just connects to the rest of the trigger bar. This rear portion actually swings down underneath into the trigger housing and is connected to this spring to reset the gun. The Gen 5 guns are a little bit different in this respect. They have a separate piece here for that. This leg that goes off to the left actually sits in a little recess in the trigger housing, and that prevents the trigger bar from being pulled or pushed down while the trigger bar is forward. And then the last portion here closest to us is what actually pulls on the firing pin or the striker. When you pull the trigger, that actually pulls the firing pin back, and then at the very end, the trigger bar drops down as it hits this part here, which is called the connector, and then it slips off the firing pin, allowing the gun to fire. I have a couple videos showing this in detail using a cutaway Glock if you want to check it out. So it has a cruciform trigger bar. I believe there's also a clause in that law that if a company that is affected by this ban, probably, the biggest of which would be Glock, if they were to redesign their pistols without a cruciform trigger bar or a system that makes it so they can't be readily converted to a machine gun using one of these currently existing switches, they would be able to get back on the California roster and be sold again. Well, Glock actually has a OEM part that doesn't have a cruciform trigger bar. It's the Glock Performance Trigger. The Glock Performance Trigger, unlike the standard trigger bar, does not have the extension in the rear that connects directly to the striker or the sear because it's a fully tensioned striker system. In case you've never seen the Glock Performance Trigger up close, you essentially have the trigger bar, it comes all the way back and then extends all the way through to give you your safety shelf. So this way you can't push down on the trigger bar without at first pulling the trigger back. You can see how there's no space to push the trigger bar down until you pull the trigger back. And in fact, you have to pull it back even further than that. This trigger bar goes straight across. It is not a cruciform. When you pull the trigger on the Glock Performance Trigger, you still have this portion of the trigger bar hit the connector, and that's what cams the trigger bar down. It's just that as it cams the trigger bar down, it pulls this little linkage down that has the sear and fires the gun. So that's why this ends up feeling kind of like a bad 1911 trigger rather than your standard like two-stage Glock trigger. So I think the V models are essentially going to be either Generation 3 or maybe even Generation 5 guns. Maybe this is an opportunity for Glock to finally get Generation 5 guns into California. I think it's going to be those pistols with some kind of Glock Performance Trigger system in there because they don't have a cruciform trigger bar like the law says, and they are not compatible, I believe, with the currently available Glock switches out there. So for everyone freaking out thinking this is going to be like something super revolutionary or a crazy change to the Glock platform, I don't think that's the case. I think it'll probably be a Glock performance trigger in one of those existing models. Or maybe they'll have another little plastic protrusion in there or something to help, or like make them not as readily convertible or whatever. Make them not as easily accept current Glock switches out there. And then for California, I think they'll probably just do the same thing with like the Generation 3s. Who knows? I guess we'll find out here soon, won't we? Anyways, if you liked this video, thank you all for watching. Thank you especially to my channel supporters and my Patreon supporters for supporting the channel directly. You too can become a channel member or a Patreon supporter by clicking the relevant links below or the links on screen. Thank you all for watching. Have a great day. I guess it's not terrible.